A Magnus miniature. We celebrate the outgoing world champion with a miniature that Magnus played just a couple of days ago against a grandmaster, Leon Livaic. It also involves a queen sacrifice. I think you're going to enjoy it. This was a blitz game played on chess.com, 3 minutes for each side with a 1 second increment. Magnus has white. Let's jump right in. He begins with c4, the English opening. Knight f6, g3, and g6 is played. King's Indian, or could be a Grunfeld. Bishop to g2 and bishop to g7, knight to c3, castles, and e4. So now we know what formation Magnus is probably going to go for here. It's probably going to be a Botvinnik English opening. And in this structure, white will often play d3, and then it'll have 3 pawn breaks to choose from, either b4, d4, or f4, depending on how black responds. It gives white a lot of options and is really difficult to play against with black. d6 was played. Knight g to e2, that's the standard idea. You don't want to block this bishop. Let it keep control over that diagonal on d5. And now c5 is the main response, trying to keep this diagonal open and control d4. But instead, his opponent played e5. Now that does block the bishop, but it keeps a little bit more control over the f4 square as well. Castles and knight to c6. Aiming at the d4 square, Magnus plays d3. This is all standard. Now knight to d7. What black wants to do, basically, the real strength of black's position is this d4 square. That's the weakest square in white's position. So what he's doing is taking the knight to d7, the one from f6, then it goes to c5 and e6, and rerouting it so he has complete domination over that d4 square, the one thing that black can hold on to in this position. Bishop to e3, also trying to control d4. Knight to c5, queen to d2. He could also play d4 or f4 here, all possibilities. Queen to d2 from Magnus, and now knight to e6. Just like we mentioned, Grandmaster Livaic wants to control the d4 square, and the knights are perfectly positioned to do so. So now we talked about those 3 pawn breaks, either b4, which you just hang a pawn, d4, and f4. And here Magnus makes his decision. He decides to break with the f pawn, an attack on the king side, either opening up the f-file or advancing to f5 and gaining space. Knight e to d4, jumping into the d4 square, and now bishop takes d4. Another strong idea, by the way, was rook to f2 and bringing the other rook over and doubling. But bishop takes d4, and he gives up a bishop, and black now has the bishop pair. But after pawn takes, this pawn does block the mobility of the bishop. But Magnus is saying the knights, I think, are going to be stronger in this position. The knight, of course, has to move and jumps into d5. And now the novelty in the position, knight to e7, challenging that well-placed knight on d5. And Magnus goes ahead and gains space, plays f5, says, I'm going to let you take my knight. I'm going to begin already my attack on the king's side. So black does take the knight, cd5. So Magnus has a very strong constellation of pawns, a lot of light square control. But he does have weak dark squares. And if black can chip away at this center, black might even be able to get the advantage from Magnus in this position. c6, he begins that process of chipping away at that center. Magnus does not want to take that pawn, so he plays knight to f4, so that if pawn takes pawn, he can retake with the knight and place it on a strong centralized square. So black plays bishop to h6, pinning the knight, so he cannot recapture on d5 with the knight. Magnus moves out of the pin, and then there goes the knight. So now, after queen takes bishop, this pawn can be undermined. The problem, of course, is that he has given up a very important dark-squared bishop, and the dark squares around black's king are vulnerable. So how is Magnus going to take advantage of that vulnerability? Well, black first takes on d5. Turns out g5, by the way, pushing the queen back was probably best given the circumstances. But he takes on d5, and now, boom, f6, right? Very simple chess. Magnus is threatening to play queen to h6, queen to g7, checkmate. That's all she wrote. So black already has to be in a very defensive posture. He plays king to h8. The idea, of course, is that of queen to h6, the rook would just move to g8 and defend against queen g7 mate. So e d5, recapturing the pawn, but also making it possible for the rook to shift to e1 and become active, perhaps at the e7 square. Bishop to f5, targeting the d3 pawn. But now a very powerful idea from Magnus, g4, hitting the bishop and clearing the way for a rook lift. Rook f3, rook to h3. And he's not that concerned about this pawn on d3. If he can get the rook to h3, black is going to be in pretty big trouble. But black goes ahead and takes that pawn anyway. And now queen to h6, threatening mate on g7. Rook to g8 is played. It's forced. He has to cover this square. And now rook to f3. Threatens rook to h3, but also threatens to hit the bishop on d3. So the bishop moves out of the way. He doesn't want to get captured. And here is a very important point in this game. If Magnus plays the move rook to h3, it looks decisive, right? It looks like that's it. He's threatening queen takes h7 mate. But black would respond with g5, and actually this is equal for black. He would have completely defended his position and be in very good shape. The bishop from c2 defends h7. The rook on g8 holds the g7 square, and black would be fine in this position. Really would be startling. So if that's the case, knowing that's the case, how does Magnus deliver the coup de grace? Do you see it? I gave you a bit of a hint earlier. That's right. Queen takes h7 check, forcing king takes queen, and rook to h3 is checkmate. A beautiful and efficient miniature from now former world champion, although probably still the best player in the world, Magnus Carlsen. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon. Bye.